Pukeology Podcast, where science meets your hilarious puke stories and the tips and tricks to stop that up-chuckle that you need.
You never know what's going to spew out of her mouth. Here's
my mama,
Dr. Pukeology.
So are you thinking about getting an epidural? I understand that birthing experience can be a little overwhelming, and have the choice of whether or not you want an epidural is one of those that deserves a little bit of consideration. As a doctor and anesthesia provider, I answer all of your questions that you have about epidurals coming up right now in Pregnancy Pukeology Podcast, episode 96. How long does the epidural actually last? Now, do you want no more morning sickness, pregnancy nausea, or how about no more headaches or migraines? Visit our sponsor, numb.com, the only natural way to instantly stop your worst nausea, vomiting, headaches, and migraines, all within seconds. And you can get actually 25% off utilizing the code PUKE25. That's PUKE25 at nomonausia.com. That's NOMONAUSEA.com. And you always know that you can put one inside of your hospital room bag, because a lot of women end up having horrible nausea and vomiting during their delivery. And then more importantly, your kids are also. We actually have No More Sleepless Nights kids as well, found at your local Walmart, AFES, CVS, and so many more places. But the easiest is getting it for free in just 2 days on Prime. Now, if you want to learn a lot more about your pregnancy, humor and knowledge is the key to help you survive these 9 months. And just know we're in this together. Today, you'll be learning the science behind how an epidural is actually placed, how long does it last, what do you do if the epidural doesn't work, and since 80% of women experience nausea and vomiting during delivery, here are labor and delivery tips on how to prevent nausea.
The science of puke, pukeology.
So I know you guys want to get into how long do epidurals last during birth, but in order to understand that, you really have to be able to understand what an epidural is and how it can actually relieve pain. Or in the event of a C-section, can an epidural be utilized for the actual C-section itself? Understanding the duration of an epidural is essential for pregnant individuals and those who are anticipating childbirth. Now, we use epidurals in many other forms and fashion, such as if you have a surgery, for example, and you want pain relief, let's say on your knee or on your shoulder, we can do different types of blocks. But what we're talking about specifically today is for the actual laboring process. Now, we're going to get into the topics of epidurals, the numbing effect, the factors that influence the efficacy, and whether you are expecting a baby or simply just super curious because one day you will want to. This podcast will basically give you everything that you need to know and valuable insights about the duration of epidurals during the childbirth so that you can make the decision on your own. Now, how long do epidurals last? If you are currently listening to this on a podcast, I highly recommend that you go on to No Mo Nausea Band on TikTok. And the reason why I'm saying that is because we are actually doing it live currently. So an epidural is utilized for pain relief, and most commonly it's put inside of the period, but you have to be in active labor. What active labor actually means is just because you're contracting does not mean that you are in active labor. Active labor means when the actual cervix is dilating, and the cervix is basically that window in which the baby is going to end up coming out. So remember, the epidural is always dependent upon what medications that I'm actually giving through it. And remember, there's actually like a little wire part. So I'm going to quickly go over. First, we actually utilize the epidural, and we sterilize the back utilizing different betadine solution. From that point on, we end up giving a little tiny bit of local anesthetic. Now, that local anesthetic numbs everything in the back because, believe it or not, you don't have pain receptors after you get back from the skin. So once we do that, we mark the back, and remember, we want to go in between the actual different vertebrae, and we want to go right in the middle. Now, an epidural is different than a spinal. An epidural is epi, meaning outside of the dura. The dura is what separates, and on the other side of the dura, you actually have what is called the cerebral spinal fluid, or the CSF. So we don't want to go inside of there, FYI. All right, secondarily, I want to make sure that you guys understand that pain relief is dependent. So once we give, this is the actual epidural needle, okay? So the epidural needle, it's not crazy, it's not huge, and by the way, I cannot touch your your actual spine itself, so don't worry, you will never be paralyzed from an actual epidural placement. Secondarily, we do not leave this inside of the back, or we don't leave the actual needle. Instead, we do place a catheter. A catheter kind of looks like a little fishing wire, okay? And it goes in threads directly through once we found the spot. And once we do, this is what's fed inside of the actual back. So this stays inside of the back, and I hope you can see that. And then from that point, we then take the needle out of the back and then tape it during the actual thing. Secondarily, what we do is we go and attach our medication. Now, attaching our medication, we are going to determine what you're going to be given. For women who are contracting away, just normal, we'll end up giving local anesthetic. A lot of places have ropivacaine, some places have bupivacaine, and that just are local anesthetics to numb the actual pain. Remember, epidurals only take away pain and not pressure. Secondarily, what we end up doing is when we give the different type of medications, we continuously give it. So there's a pump or something that's actually continuously pushing the medication itself. So it's kind of interesting for you guys to note what medication that we have, and that determines how long thereafter. But technically, you can keep an epidural in literally for days. But remember, when it comes to pregnancy, you want to make sure that it works during the active part of labor and when the baby's coming out. So don't try to get your epidural too early. I always say about 4 centimeters is absolutely perfect. You will be feeling the contractions, especially if you're on Pitocin. And then last but not least, you will be begging me for it. All right, secondarily, how long can the epidural provide pain relief? Well, the duration of the epidural's numbing effects varies depending upon the dose. If I give lidocaine, for example, it's very quick, fast acting on, and then it's fast acting off, meaning in about 30 minutes or 30 minutes to an hour or so, your legs would be back to being regular. Now, if I use something like ropivacaine, it'll take about an hour and 2 hours. If I use bupivacaine, it'll be between about 2 to 3 hours or so. So when it comes to the epidural, the amount of medication determines the degree of numbness that's provided. So when we actually dose the epidural, we'll end up giving what's called a loading dose. A loading dose generally tends to be about 10 cc's or so, depending upon your height. Okay, and I'm just giving you an example utilizing ropivacaine. When we do that, we want you to be comfortable basically up right above the actual belly button itself. So when we're giving that and when we're dosing it, we dose it appropriately. Women who are pregnant also are very edematous, meaning they have a lot of extra fluid and a lot of extra tissue. Okay, I'm not trying to call you fat. I'm just trying to say, hey, there's a lot of extra tissue, which means if the canal is smaller, you have to give a smaller dose than you normally would because it's shooting right straight up. Okay, so again, now, questions on C-sections, right? What happens if you have an epidural and you go to a C-section? Now, epidurals are good and can be utilized for an actual C-section, but remember, what we need to do is we need to be able to make sure that we have a very good block or a very good level, because a C-section, they're cutting from one side to the other versus a regular labor, you are just pushing the baby out. So factors that are affecting the duration of this epidural are the type of medication that we talked about, the physiological response to the medication, and also the progress of labor, how fast. And I always use the example, if you have a woman right now, okay, she goes like I did from 4 centimeters to 10 centimeters dilated in 15 minutes, you've literally gone from taking a little hose, okay, from a hose to going from a little tiny kiddie pool to now an Olympic-sized swimming pool, okay? It hasn't had time to catch up. And that's the time when you just call on your anesthesia provider and say, hey, I need a little bolus. A bolus just means a little extra pump. You can also, there are some providers, and I included, will sometimes utilize pain medication there just to get people a little bit more comfortable, because in the epidural space, there are slightly pain bandings. So sometimes when women say, oh, I feel a little different or more numb on one side to the other, unfortunately, that's just the way your pain bands are actually made inside of your body and how the baby is pushing on them. So managing pain relief through labor, you have to remember that they are going to be continuously monitoring you, okay? So from your nursing staff all the way through your anesthesia provider, okay? So we talked about how do epidurals work. We understand the mechanism in which it provides pain relief. Pain relief, we are targeting directly the mu receptors of the brain, meaning mu is actually the pain receptors. That's what opioids and other pain receptors utilize too. So we are blocking those receptors. That's the reason why you can still feel touch, but you'll feel a little bit of a temperature difference as well. Now, can an epidural be adjusted for optimal numbness? Absolutely. We can increase it, we can decrease it, whatever it is that we need to get you comfortable. And remember, it's gravity dependent. When I say gravity dependent, I mean if you are more numb on the right side, well, guess what? You need to tilt to the left, because then the medication will start to traverse down towards your left side. And more importantly, okay, if you're sitting directly up, all of the medicine is going to your toes or your feet. So you're not having a baby in your toes. You might want to lay back down. Okay, so we already talked about the epidurals being okay for C-sections, and actually that is what is considered standard of care, to utilize a good working epidural and in that way. Now, should I get an epidural for labor? No one is here, okay? They've been having babies for thousands. Women have been having babies in the fields for thousands of years without an epidural. But it makes it way better. From personal experience, I actually think that the rotavirus was far worse than I got than my actual entire labor experience. I pushed 3 times and my beautiful baby was out. So that being said, let's go to a few tips and tricks while we still have some time.
Tips and tricks to stop the up-chuckle that you need.
So as I talked about before, remember, 80% of women, that's 80% of women will have nausea and vomiting, unfortunately. But there are different ways that you can actually prevent this, okay? And so that is with inside of the hospital. A lot of hospitals have them. They're called no-mo nausea bands. They are essential oils, so they smell, and acupressure bands. So all you have to do, if you start to feel sick, you just put one on, you smell it, and it's kind of in the same category as alcohol swipes. Okay, alcohol swipes are what you basically just kind of sniff on. Some people, though, do not like that smell, and believe it or not, no-mo nausea band was actually created because more people like the peppermint smell than they do the actual alcohol itself. So you need to make sure that you stay well informed. There are other reasons or indications for OBGYNs asking us anesthesia providers to make sure that their patients have an epidural. And that is because, number one, if you have a very big baby and they think it's going to be very difficult, that means a lot more pain and or potentially an episiotomy, which is basically where, unfortunately, you slit and or you get cut from one side to the other. Secondarily, if you are doing a VBAC, meaning that is when you've already had a C-section and you come back for a vaginal birth, having an epidural is actually wonderful because it ensures that if we do have to emergently rush you to the operating room, we'd be able to utilize that. So last but not least, I just want to make sure that you guys understand that epidurals are very common for pain relief during childbirth, and they vary, right? Again, vary by individual, whether or not you have an incredible experience or whether or not you don't. And I will tell you, it's provider, kind of provider related because of the fact of how much experience that we actually have in it. And then again, it's what that person physiologically or anatomically is able to end up handling. All right, once again, guys, this is an epidural. And so I hope that you have enjoyed this incredible. So remember, what is the duration of the epidural? Technically, as long as it's inside of your body, we can still give you medication and we can keep dosing it up or down, but usually about 2 hours hours after you give birth is when your toes start to come back and you start to be able to, move around and things like that. So thanks again for watching. And if you give me hearts for likes, also make sure that you share it with any of your Prego friends. Thanks again, guys, and join me for another episode of the best pregnancy podcast, Pukeology.
Pukeology Podcast.